Hi everyone, I'm Taylor Hudak and I am joined by journalist Kit Klarenberg. Today we are going to be discussing Chelsea Manning being released from prison. We learned this yesterday and this is really good and positive news for both Chelsea and her legal team. So here to discuss more on that is congressional candidate Nathaniel Mulcahy from Massachusetts 6th District. So Nathaniel, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you very much. It's after all these months and years of struggle, it's nice to see some positive news for Chelsea, although I'm more than a little concerned about the unjust fine that she's going to have to deal with. But I think her supporters will be able to help take care of that.
Yes, and later on in this show, we will be highlighting ways that the viewers and people who support Chelsea Manning and other whistleblowers can help contribute to her legal funds so she can pay off this tremendous debt that she does have. So Nathaniel, I do want you to kind of just describe for everybody right now why you support Chelsea Manning and why you advocate for whistleblowers.
Happy to. So I've been a strong supporter of Chelsea from the very beginning. We within this country take great pride in democracy, and it can be argued whether or not we actually have one at this moment, but should we have one, or should we be striving to have one, one of the fundamental elements for making sure we have one are whistleblowers. You can't have a government without a checks and balances system. And Chelsea courageously was just that. She was the whistleblower, but in a way that followed all the rules. So she went to her superior, she brought up the attention to her superior, she did all the correct steps, and none of that was responded to correctly. And because of that, she then became a whistleblower in the sort of popular sense of a whistleblower, and has, because of her courage, suffered absolutely unjust punishments. And the fact that she and Julian Assange and Reality Winner and Edward Snowden, to a different extent, are being punished for keeping our government honest, tells us that our government essentially is not being honest.
I actually wanted to I wanted to ask you, Nathaniel, about the difference between coercive and punitive incarceration. Is that something you're able to talk about?
Not to a great extent, because I'm certainly not a lawyer, nor am I a legal expert. But but we do have, at least within this country, we have the concept that whistleblowers are to be legally protected. They should not be facing any punitive damage or punitive consequences for coming out with what is factually based. The other critical thing to keep in mind here is the Fifth Amendment, which is a constitutional right. And Chelsea had already testified about WikiLeaks. She had already testified about this. She had then been exonerated, had been released and freed. They brought her in. So you cannot be tried twice for the same crime. They did. You can, and you have the right to not self-incriminate, which she chose to invoke and was prohibited from doing that. So this is, one could say this is a constitutional emergency as well as a democratic emergency for this country.
So that's a really great point that you bring up, Kit. So can you maybe describe through your perspective, if you would like, how you see these fines in particular? Because for everybody that's watching right now, do know that Chelsea Manning was not only being incarcerated because she refused to testify before a grand jury investigating WikiLeaks, but she was also being fined at first $500 a day, and then after a certain period of time, she was then being fined $1,000 a day. So, Kit, how do you see this?
Well, I mean, this concept will be quite difficult for a lot of viewers outside the US to understand, because typically people, when they are punished, the clues in the title, in a legal sense, it is punitive. So they'll be fined for criminal activity or incarcerated for criminal activity. But in the US, and I'm not entirely sure whether this is unique to the States, someone can be held in civil contempt in order to coerce their compliance with the court's order to testify before the grand jury. This isn't punishment; it's strictly to try and compel people to like to speak, which is quite a threatening concept because the right to silence, and as Nathaniel mentions, the right against self-incrimination is a long-standing legal principle. But also, grand juries in themselves will be quite an alien concept to a lot of viewers, I would imagine, outside the US. And I believe it's only the US and Liberia that still maintain. What are your thoughts on that, Nathaniel?
Within the context of whistleblowers and the right to remain silent and not self-incriminate, I think that is. I think we are witnessing, not only within the United States but globally, an erosion of this right, and it itself is a very dangerous warning for all of us. It has far-reaching consequences, not just in terms of our democracy, but in terms of public safety. We had talked before we started today's interview briefly. If we want, it is justifiable to say that whistleblowers not only save democracy but can save lives. Right now, globally, we are facing the pandemic of the COVID-19 or the coronavirus. The whistleblower in Wuhan, China, the doctor who was the original whistleblower for it, was punitively punished for his courageous speaking out, just as Chelsea was in this case. And the end result were thousands of deaths. Within this country too, we had whistleblowers trying to alert us to the dangers of the corona outbreak prior to our government taking action. And as a consequence, our government not only suppressed those whistleblowers, but then delayed acting towards responding to this very serious pandemic that we are now facing. The consequences then could be easily showing that whistleblowers not only save democracy but save lives, and in the case of Chelsea, she saved democracy, possibly lives as well, because the viral video that certainly brought all of our attention to Chelsea of the civilians and reporter being shot.
Collateral murder.
Yeah, absolutely correct. That's the right word. Brutally so, and for sport. I think the world became aware of that, and as a consequence, more lives were saved, because those actions, I think, would be harder to do following what Chelsea released.
Given the significance of what Chelsea released, and indeed the service that she did to democracy, why do you think there aren't more prominent supporters of her in the mainstream, whether politically or otherwise?
My opinion on this is people are afraid. I think the what Chelsea has been subjected to since her courageous whistleblowing and her right of invoking her Fifth Amendment have been a wake-up call to anybody who might have been tempted to stand up for democracy, who might have been tempted to themselves be a whistleblower. This was not to punish Chelsea. This was to prevent anyone else from ever being as courageous as Chelsea has been.
Sure, I think it was absolutely to also set an example of Chelsea Manning, to discourage others from following the same path that she has. Now, also, too, I think the fact, at least for politicians and people who are in positions of power, the fact that they are fearful to maybe come out and state that they do support Chelsea Manning for the heroic actions that she took. The fact that they're afraid to do so because of the potential political consequences for doing so is really indicative of a much larger problem that we have systemically.
I would absolutely agree. If you look within the U.S. politics right now, and as a congressional candidate, it's certainly been eye-opening to see things politically from sort of an inside perspective now. You know, people say, what's the hardest thing about running for office? And my first reaction is all the snarky comments that I'm not allowed to say in public anymore. But aside from the snark, you gauge everything you say for fear that it'll either hurt or help your campaign. And I think because I'm not a politician, you know, I'm a scientist, I'm an engineer, I run a humanitarian company. I have been more outspoken about Chelsea. I wonder if that were the case, if I were already in Congress, if I would still be as outspoken. And I would hope to be. I would hope to be. But I can see, you can see even the most progressive candidates, once they're in office, you see them slowly shifting and falling in line. One of the reasons that I really support Bernie Sanders is he's never fallen in line. You know, for 40 years, he has done his own thing, and that has come with consequences, sometimes not so good for him. But we need more people who are not worried about the consequences of their action and who are willing to stand up for truth. And that is, at its core, why we all need to be supporting Chelsea Manning.
You mentioned Bernie Sanders is outspoken in general. I mean, he's been. I'm not sure he's been particularly vocal on Chelsea or indeed Assange.
I don't think he has. You know, within anybody's existence, you choose your battles. And you know, as a candidate, could I have 32 platform issues? Possibly. Would that be useful? No, because it would detract from certain core issues. I think he is wisely focusing on some core issues that are fundamental for explaining who he is and what his platform is. But he has certainly been a champion of democracy from the very beginning. I mean, look at his stand on Palestine, which is a not very popular stand within politics in the United States. He objected to the moving of the embassy. He is for Palestinian statehood. Those are not politically prudent viewpoints, but he's been outspoken about them. That's what we need. We need people who are willing to say what is truth. Chelsea did that. Bernie does that on his topics. In my own very small way, I attempt to do that, and that is why I'm delighted to be part of this conversation today.
Yeah, and we're really happy to have you joining us, of course, and speaking about this very important issue. On the subject of Bernie Sanders, I have been very critical about his failure to mention Julian Assange's name and his failure to really stand up for the First Amendment as it's really being under threat with this potential extradition from the UK to the US. I've been very critical of him on that. I think that we need to kindly and politely put pressure on him to really make a statement about this issue. But you do bring a very interesting perspective, Nathaniel, when you're talking about how the candidates need to focus on certain issues. Having like 32 campaign platforms that you're really running on is quite difficult. And that makes sense. And that's a good point you bring up. Yet at the same time, I think that fighting for the First Amendment and for a free press has to be one of those key and essential issues, at least for me. At least for me, that's a really important issue. Now, earlier in the conversation, before we started filming, I'm sorry if you hear dogs barking. I hope you can't. Okay. Yep. Earlier, you can.
Yep. Love dogs. They're great.
Okay. I'm sorry about that.
You'll hear mine. Mine is snoring every so often, so that's slightly different.
So, Nathaniel, I do want you to maybe talk about your political opponent. We were discussing this prior to filming this morning, but can you talk about your political opponent and perhaps his stance on whistleblowers and why your stance is better?
Better is a different word. It's a challenging word because I would say we're different. We're certainly different, and we come from very different perspectives. My opponent is Seth Moulton. He's been in Congress now for 3 terms. He's a Marine. He's decorated. He is had an honorable service, and he's been a real champion of veterans. His perspective on how to approach things is very different from mine. I think it was either 99 or 2000 is when he enlisted, and in 99 or 2000 is when I founded a humanitarian company. We both deal with problems in developing nations. We both deal with issues around the world. I've been working in 16 countries, and Seth Moulton has also been overseas. But there's a very big difference between picking up a gun and picking up a bag of rice and beans. We're both, in our minds, working to make the world safer. We have very different approaches. Not being within the military, I have, and I've been against military interventions for every possible reason. Obviously, if you are enlisting, you are not against military interventions. I should actually preface that by saying, in this country, a lot of people can't afford college and enlist because that provides them with the opportunity to go to the university.
Yes, exactly. I wanted to make that distinction too.
Yeah. Right,
unfortunately, it's sort of a way people do often have to join the military because they have no other option.
But
you're right.
But my opponent, it was not in that position. He's a Harvard graduate. He grew up in Marblehead, which is an exclusive seaside community. He comes from a place of privilege. It was not that he needed to get an opportunity at the university. He had all the opportunities, and he chose to pick up a gun instead of pick up a bag of rice and beans. So his perspective is going to be very different than mine, and it's from that. I think if asked directly, both of us will say that we are on the right side. I think both would probably be able to make an argument for that. And from his perspective as an officer, there are certain protocols that he would have to follow, which I am free to not follow, which therefore liberates me to be able to be a greater champion of democracy, perhaps. I mean, that sounds pretentious, but I have great respect for the military. There are certain protocols that they have to follow once you get in, and that keeps units safe, but it also highlights the courage that Chelsea had, because Chelsea in particular went around the current protocols. Those failed, and then she went against them. And to do that is a higher level of courage than if she had just done the.
And I mean, I just wondered whether sorry, we'll try that again. I wondered whether you had any thoughts on whether Chelsea's release was in any way connected to Julian Assange's ongoing extradition hearings, whether that was an indication that the US government sees Assange's extradition to the US as a kind of fait accompli, an inevitability at this point.
I'm not sure they're related. I certainly cherish the hope that the Australian government will step in and defend their own citizen at some point. I mean, it is unconscionable that the Australian government has not stepped in, especially after all the charges against Assange have been dropped. So he is now free of any charge and still imprisoned. So I mean, that is outrageous to think that he's still in jail.
It really is. And to just clarify quickly, so Assange was imprisoned for a 50-week sentence initially for violating bail. He was given a very harsh penalty for that, but he served his sentence. So right now he is in Belmarsh prison as a political prisoner at this time. And then I can speak a little bit to what Kit was saying, and then I'll let you finish your point, Nathaniel. But what we can at least assume and gather from the facts that Chelsea Manning has been released, and now that this entire grand jury investigation has been dropped, is that there are, of course, or at least as of right now, there are no additional charges that they are going to put against Assange or any other WikiLeaks staff members. That we do know.
I can't speak to that. I wonder if the government started. I mean, a $250,000 fine is certainly a punitive fine, but the Fifth Amendment is a constitutional right, and the precedent that they are setting there is a dangerous one. I wonder if the value at this point. Chelsea is hard pressed to face a fine which must be paid upon release. But $250,000, or it's around there, is not an insurmountable sum. So they could do the punitive fine with the fair understanding that her supporters, the three of us included, I assume, would likely be contributing to that, and it is not impossible to assume that her supporters will be able to cobble together the amount that's needed. Had that fine gone to, say, $1 million or $2 million, there would have been no way that her supporters would have been able to cobble together that sort of funds, or a very, very unlikely chance that it would happen, in which case then the government would find itself in the awkward position of, we've said you can't be released, we know that you're not guilty, you have not charged with any crime, the Fifth Amendment does protect you, and we have given you a fine that it is impossible for you to meet. So that puts the government in a very difficult situation. I think the growing fine, more than Assange, may have been a deciding factor in this matter, because there's an expression my father taught me when I was very young, which is, you give golden bridges to an enemy retreating. So they decided, how do we wiggle out of this situation in a way that we maintain the image of strong government, strong punitive action for whistleblowers, but allow us to get out of the situation before it is out of our hands, and we have to then erase the fine, which would make us look weak.
What are the consequences if, I mean, because the wording of the release judgment specifically says it's payable immediately. So presumably that means the day that she's out of prison. What are the consequences if she doesn't pay? And I mean, and what's the kind of time frame in which she's going to need to pay?
Again, I'm not a lawyer, so I can only speculate. But from the wording, if you read very carefully, it's clear that she can't be released unless she has the funds. So therefore, trapped indefinitely. But that's the sort of the panic mode that I think they were getting at. They figured at 250, she'll be able to get that and be released. At 2 million or 3 million, they'd be stuck with this hot potato with no way out without losing face.
Now, I think the timing in all of this is, of course, very interesting because the first part of Julian Assange's full extradition hearing just took place. I was actually covering this from London with a lot of help from Kit, a lot of help from him. We basically worked together to cover this hearing. And we learned, now I was not reporting from inside the courtroom, I was outside the courtroom, but we did learn on Tuesday, I believe, Monday or Tuesday, early on in the hearing, this first part of the hearing, we learned that the United States really did mischaracterize the sort of associations that were taking place between Manning and Assange. They tried to frame it as if these two individuals were co-conspirators, when in reality, Manning was just trying to use this certain account and get into this computer for entertainment purposes, not to gain access to classified material to then leak to WikiLeaks. And so I think that it's the defense and the arguments that they presented in court during the hearing that really initiated the U.S., this judge in particular, Anthony Tranga, to release Chelsea Manning. The U.S. is seeing that they do not have a strong case here at all. And in fact, that was indicative of an abuse of process.
That's incredibly enlightening.
So with that being said, of course, it's really, really important that people who support Chelsea Manning and support whistleblowers really do step up if you can, and support her by donating. And I know that there are there's a GoFundMe that's been created, and there is also another charity that's been set up. Kit, if you could maybe explain where people can find this information, how they can donate. It's really important to do this. And of course, we know that not everybody is able to donate. Not everybody is able to do so, but just circulating that link on social media, telling your friends, your family, making people aware about this is just as helpful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, there are two primary crowdfunding initiatives. One is connected with Save Manning, which is obviously a dedicated support group for Chelsea. But I think you highlight something very important, which is the need for anyone who supports Chelsea or Assange, or indeed is just passionate about like free speech and and worried about the future of journalism, to publicize this any way they can when they're talking to family and friends, or like posting on social media, because there is a almost total mainstream media blackout on the actual facts of these kind of intimately intertwined cases, based on the kind of relentless condemnation of mainstream journalists, one would think that Chelsea and Julian are evil people who who no right-minded person would support, and in reality there are millions of people around the world who do and indeed could support them if fully educated about the specifics of what's actually going on. So yeah, it's very much in the hands of grassroots supporters.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And I do want to make note as well that the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, Niels Melzer, and I believe this is the second UN Special Rapporteur on Torture, has ruled that Chelsea Manning has been subjected to torture just like Julian Assange, and that it's very important that she receive a lot of support. So do write letters to her. I know people have been doing that while she was in prison. I'm not so sure if that's going to be as feasible now that she is going to be out of prison, but just showing support in so many ways is just very helpful, because unfortunately she will be having to really cope with the trauma that she has experienced the past several years. Remember, Chelsea Manning is somebody who has spent the majority of her adult life in prison, and that's going to weigh heavily on her. So showing that support is very important. If that is donating, if that is circulating a link, writing a letter, whichever way you can, it's very beneficial. Now, before we do close out, I want to thank our guest, Nathaniel Mulcahy, for joining us. Do let everybody, I know you're running for Congress in the 6th Congressional District in Massachusetts. So I want you to have the last word here, and I want you to have the opportunity to discuss why you're running, and I know you alluded to it earlier, but why you're running and why you are the best choice for the people in this district. And then also do let everybody know where they can find you on social media and where they can find more information about your campaign.
Thank you for that opportunity, but I'd actually prefer to first focus a little longer on Chelsea with one critical thing that I beseech the world to not overlook. So Chelsea is not by herself. I mean, she is part of a small but critical group of whistleblowers, including Reality Winner, Edward Snowden, Julian Assange. we can't forget their other names. But one thing which we haven't discussed today, and I think is a core reality, and is that Chelsea is a trans woman. The courage she has in becoming herself within this horrific process that she's been going through is something that we must not overlook, because the trans community is some of the most oppressed globally. And so Chelsea is oppressed not only for being a whistleblower, but she is also oppressed for being trans. This is an issue that we need to bring up. I discussed with you briefly that this aspect of Chelsea's courage so moved me that I commissioned that painting that I sent to you guys earlier.
Yes. Do you mind if I show that right now?
No, that would be great.
Can you talk a little bit about this painting here?
So if you look, I've put on the watermark of the artist that I hired to commission to make this painting. And there are two figures there. So I had this vision of what I wanted for the painting. I'm not a painter, but I know a wonderful painter. His name's Dave Laveracom. He's a Colorado artist. And I reached out to him and said, listen, I have this crazy idea for a painting. Can I commission this? And when he heard why, he was absolutely enthusiastic to be part of the painting. So in this painting are two people, Chelsea Manning, and do either of you recognize who the other woman is? The other woman
is muted. He was responding.
Sorry, I do not, I'm afraid.
That's okay. And that's why I wanted to bring this up. The other woman is Marsha Johnson. So Marsha Johnson is was a friend of mine. She's gone now, but we met each other in the late 80s and early 90s. But she was one of the key figures of the Stonewall riots, and her courage has essentially allowed the LGBTQ community to be free to be who they are. Chelsea Manning has allowed for democracy to be saved and to protect whistleblowers. And at one point, in reflecting over my past life and the life of these two courageous women, I realized that the entire world, hence the background, is improved, which means two trans women, 50 years apart, by themselves, courageously took action which have made the entire world better. And I saw that link as being incredibly profound.
Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that painting with us. It's so important. And then for everybody that is watching right now that wants to help, I want to make sure that you guys do have the resources to help this situation. So I am looking that up right now to give you guys the specific websites, and then I'll also link it in the description here. Kit, who is also my co-host today, I want you to have an opportunity to also provide a final message to the viewers why you're passionate about this case and why this is something that's very important to you. I think we can't help, of course, but discuss the reasons why Chelsea Manning was really being targeted here. It's because she's a whistleblower, of course, but also because of what she has exposed, which was the U.S. military-industrial complex, which is a huge threat to those who are in power. I think it's so important to highlight that. Now, Kit, I know you're not an American citizen, you're in the U.K., but can you talk a little bit about that point I just made?
I mean, sure. I mean, I think that the entire case points to like just the impunity and global reach of the U.S. empire. So you have, the collateral murder video, which we discussed briefly earlier. I mean, this was, like the cold-blooded, killing for sport of innocent people, including journalists. which, you know, were it not for Chelsea, wouldn't have gone, you know, largely, if not completely, unknown about, would have been swept under the rug, and no one would be the wiser, and the US would be able to, you know, to a certain degree, maintain this illusion of, you know, humanitarian intervention, and, you know, to, like, standing up for you know, like, freedom and democracy worldwide, and then yet you know, the people who've been punished for you know, for that video are not the murderers featured therein, but the person who released it. And also, I mean, yeah, this touches on Julian Assange's, you know, impending extradition. I mean, he's not, as, I mean, we can argue about you know, what crimes he may have committed under, you know, US law or not, and it's, you know, it's been abundantly clear over the course of the extradition hearings at the start of March that actually he seemingly hadn't committed any. But I mean, the reality is that even if he had broken US law, he's not in the US. You know, he's an Australian citizen who was in latterly an Ecuadorian citizen. So what possible right did the US say, well, you know, like, send him over, you know, incarcerate him and send him over here so we can be tried in our courts? And I think that this is I mean, obviously, the persecution of both Chelsea and Julian is done for the purposes of intimidation, to create a chilling effect, to, you know, prevent people speaking out, prevent people from reporting on these things. And it's, you know, it's worrying to me, you know, looking further down the line, you know, in 5 years' time, like, you know, what kind of information, you know, journalists could write about, which could, you know, conceivably land them in prison, could conceivably, you know, end up them getting extradited to the US and facing, you know, life imprisonment in a supermax prison for the crime of telling the truth. And this is something that the entire, you know, every single journalist in the world needs to be extremely concerned about, and indeed, you know, engaged, like, citizens need to be too. And that's why the media blackout on this is quite so shocking and unsettling.
It is really unsettling. And also, just quickly here, if you feel comfortable, Kit, but for the viewers who may not be familiar with your work, can you talk about some of the things that you write about and your own journalistic work? Kit, I know he's not going to say this himself, but he is an excellent journalist. Actually, Susie Dawson first mentioned him to me because of his investigative journalism. Can you talk about some of your work, if you feel comfortable, and where people can find your articles?
Sure. I mean, I think rather pompously, my Twitter bio states that I investigate state crimes against democracy. But yeah, I'm interested in the impact that power and power structures and powerful individuals have on you know, average people, whether that's the intelligence services or, you know, like big business, etc. And you can find me on Twitter, which is just Kit Klarenberg, my name, all one word, and I publish in a number of places, but that's the best place to get my content. So there we are.
Yeah, and so for everybody watching, Kit and I will continue to do these video clips together with something that we kind of talked about in London, and then we really decided to really get going once I got back to the US. So we'll continue to do this where we really focus on issues that matter to us both as it relates to a free press, and then also the abuses of power by the intelligence agencies, something I'm very passionate about, something that Kit writes about quite frequently. But before we do close out here, I want to let everybody know how they can help Chelsea Manning, who again has a $256,000 fine that she does have to pay, and she needs all of our help to pay this off, of course. You can do so by going to her GoFundMe, which I will put in the description, and then also to Action Network Legal Defense. Her Action Network Legal Defense website also has a link where you can help her out, and I will put that on the screen so everybody is able to more easily find that. Nathaniel, again, I want to thank you for joining us. It's been great to have you with us, and we look forward to hearing more about your campaign and wishing you luck.
Thank you very much. It's been an honor to be part of this conversation. I look forward to more of them. There are obviously millions of points that we've left unsaid. Kit, in particular, thank you for your reporting. Taylor, thank you. I think the two of you are too modest, because while Kit brings up the importance of protecting journalism, I think a distinction needs to be made between independent journalists and mainstream journalists. And Taylor and Kit, you represent what is journalism now. If you look at mainstream media, where they force and shape the public narrative, that's not journalism anymore. And so we owe a debt of gratitude not only to whistleblowers, but to brave independent journalists who, just like Chelsea, are facing punitive consequences for their courageous actions.
Yes, thank you for that. Independent journalism is absolutely the way to go. It's the only way to really get the truth out and not be controlled by these larger, very powerful entities. So it's something we both, and all three of us here, find to be really, really important, is that journalism remain independent. Again, thank you both. And thank you, Nathaniel, especially for joining us this morning, and good luck on your campaign.